I sold Eli Bracken the ticket that took him out of Sable Crossing, and 15 years later I was the one standing on the platform when the eastbound brought him back. A man works a depot long enough. He stops believing in coincidence. He starts believing in arithmetic. The trains run on a schedule, and so, it turns out, do the things we run from. I was old by then. My knuckles had swelled up so I could barely punch a ticket, and I'd taken to keeping a stool behind the cage so my hip wouldn't seize. The morning he came back was a raw one in early April, the kind where the wind off the Quill River cuts under your coat and finds the part of you that remembers being cold once and never forgave it. I had the stove going and the schedule chalked, and I wasn't expecting anything but the milk cans and a drummer or two. Then the eastbound shuddered in, all steam and brake squeal, and a man stepped down onto my platform who I knew before I rightly recognized him. It was the way he stood. Eli Bracken had always stood like he was bracing for the world to argue with him. He'd done it at 19, hat in his hands, asking me what a ticket to Cheyenne cost and counting his coins twice because the answer was more than he had. He did it now at 34, except the coins weren't a worry anymore, and the hat was good felt and the coat was good wool, and his face had been weathered into something harder and quieter than the boy I remembered. But the stance was the same. Braced, like a fence post set deep against a wind that hadn't come yet. He looked up the street toward the town, and I watched him do it, and I knew exactly what he was looking for, because I'd watched a woman do the same thing from the other direction more mornings than I could count. He was looking for the clock. It stands in the tower of the meeting hall, the Sable Crossing clock, a four-faced thing the town bought off a foundry catalog the year the rail came through, back when we all thought we were going to be a city. We never got to be a city, but we kept the clock, and the clock kept us in a manner of speaking because somebody had to wind it, and for 15 years that somebody had been Della Hartwell. Eli's eyes found the tower. The hands read 20 past 8. I saw his jaw work and I saw him take that in, the fact that the clock was running, that it still ran, that the town still measured its hours, and that meant somebody was still climbing those tower stairs with the crank. He didn't know it was her, not yet. He had a guess, maybe, a hope buried down under 15 years of telling himself not to hope, but he didn't know. I could have told him. God forgive me, I had it in my power to walk out from behind that cage and tell him a great many things. I didn't. I sat on my stool and I let him gather his bag and I said, "Bracken," the way you'd say it to any man you half remembered, and he turned and looked at me with no recognition at all for a long second, and then something cleared behind his eyes. "Mr. Crow," he said, "you're still here." "Where would I go?" I said. He almost smiled. "It didn't reach all the way. I figured the town would have buried you and put a younger man in the cage." They tried. I outlasted the younger man. I came off the stool because it seemed wrong to talk to him from behind bars, and my hip howled and I let it. "You've been gone a long time." "I have," he said. "You make your fortune." He looked down the street again. The wind pushed at him and he didn't move. "I made enough," he said. "Took longer than I told myself it would. A thing always does." That was the truest sentence anybody said to me that whole spring, and he said it like a man who'd paid for the knowledge by the year. I want to tell this right, so I have to back up, and the backing up is the part that costs me. Because the boy who left and the man who came back are easy to talk about. It's the middle I have to account for. It's the middle where I did the thing I did. When Eli Bracken was 19, he worked for the Pell outfit running cattle up from the Texas line, and he was, by every account including my own, a good hand and a poor prospect. Good with horses, good with men, good with the 100 small mercies that a herd needs to come through alive. Poor with money, because he didn't have any, and poorer still with standing, because his people were nobody and he'd come up rough. And he was in love with Della Hartwell, who was 18 and the only child of Ambrose Hartwell, the watchmaker, the man who wound the town clock before she did. I remember them young. You couldn't not. They had that thing some couples have where the air between them seems to hum, where you feel like an intruder for standing in the same room. She'd come down to the depot when the trains ran, ostensibly to collect a parcel for her father's shop, springs and balance wheels, and the small bright bones of the watches he kept alive. And Eli would somehow have business at the depot at the very same hour, and the two of them would stand at the end of my platform pretending to watch the rails and not fooling a soul. Ambrose Hartwell saw it the way a man sees a crack in a watch crystal, small and getting bigger and ruinous if you let it run. He came to me. I was younger than myself, not young exactly, but young enough to think a respectable man's worry was the same as a respectable man's wisdom. Ambrose was respected. He had the cleanest hands in town and a Sunday coat and a way of looking at you over his spectacles that made you feel you'd left a job half done. He came to my cage one evening after the last train and he said, "Linus, I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me know when mail comes through for my Della. From a certain quarter." I knew the quarter he meant. Everybody did. "That boy is going to write to her," Ambrose said. "He's going off to make something of himself, or so he believes, and he'll write, and her head will stay full of him, and she'll wait. She's a girl who'll wait. I know my own daughter. She'll spend the best years she's got waiting on a drover's letters, and one day there won't be letters anymore, because that is how it goes with boys who go off to make something of themselves. And she'll be 30 and alone, and it'll be too late for her to have the life she ought to have." He took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and I will tell you he looked in that moment like a man in pain. "I am trying to spare her 15 years, he said. "I am trying to spare her exactly that." It is a terrible thing how close a man can come to the truth and still be the author of the very ruin he's trying to prevent. He said 15 years. He named the number himself, and then he made it come to pass. What he asked me to do was simple, and that was the worst of it, how simple. When a letter came addressed to Della Hartwell in a hand he described to me, and he described it, the cramped, careful hand of a man who'd learned his letters late, I was to set it aside and give it to him, not to her. He'd see to it. He'd handle it gently, he said. He'd save it. He just didn't want it reaching her while she was young enough to throw her life away on it. And I did it. I have asked myself for the better part of 2 decades why I did it, and the answers I come up with don't flatter me. Because Ambrose was respected and Eli wasn't. Because a father's claim on a daughter felt like a law of nature back then, and a drover's claim on her heart felt like weather. Because I was tired most evenings, and it was easier to take the letter and put it under the counter than to weigh the soul of the thing. Because nobody was watching me do it except God, and I'd gotten in the habit of forgetting he counted the small ones too. The first letter came in June, 6 weeks after Eli left. I held it. The second came in July. I held that one too. They came all that first year, regular as the moon, that cramped, careful hand getting a little surer with practice, and I held every one and I gave them to Ambrose Hartwell, who I have to believe kept his word and saved them rather than burned them because of what came later. The second year they came less often, but they came. The third year there were 4. The fourth year 2. By the 5th year there was 1, a thick one, come in the dead of winter, and then there were no more. And in all those years I watched Della Hartwell walk to the end of my platform when the Eastern mail came in, and I watched her not ask me anything, because she was too proud to ask, and I watched her watch the rails the way she'd once watched them with a boy beside her, and then walk back up the hill to her father's shop with nothing in her hands. So you see why I sat on my stool that April morning and didn't tell Eli Bracken who wound the clock. A coward gets quieter with age, not braver. He just gets better at telling himself it's prudence. The town of Sable Crossing took the news of Eli's return the way a pond takes a stone. A ripple, a spread, and then the surface closing over like nothing had happened, except everything underneath was disturbed for a while. He'd come back with money, which the town respected, and a purpose, which it was curious about. He bought the old Vance section north of the river within the week, 4,000 acres of grass that had gone to thistle since the Vance widow gave up on it, and he hired men and bought wire and started in like a man who'd planned this purchase across half a continent and a third of his life, which I expect he had. But he hadn't planned or hadn't let himself plan what he'd do about Della, and the town, being a town, planned it for him before he could. "You hear Eli Bracken's back," they said to her in the mercantile in the church porch at the well. "You hear he's bought the Vance place." They said it kind, mostly. They said it the way you'd warn someone the ice was thin, because the town remembered too. The town had watched the two of them at the end of my platform, and the town had watched her wait, and the town had its own version of the story, which was that the drover went off and forgot her, the way drovers do, and the watchmaker's girl was left to make the best of it, which she had admirably, by becoming the woman who kept the clock and the shop in her own counsel and never married a soul. I have to tell you about the life she built, because if I just tell you she waited, I've lied, and I've done enough of that. When Ambrose Hartwell died, and that's a part of the story too, I'll come to it, Della Hartwell did not fold up. She took over the watch shop. A woman, mending watches and clocks in the small, precise machinery of a town's time, in a country where a woman keeping a shop on her own name was a thing people clucked over. She let them cluck. She'd learned the trade at her father's elbow since she was a girl, and it turned out she had better hands than he'd had and twice the patience. And within a couple of years, the ranchers from 3 counties were bringing her their grandfather's watches because she could bring back the dead ones nobody else would touch. She took on the town clock because somebody had to, and because she wouldn't ask the council for a man to do it. Twice a week she climbed the tower with the crank and wound the great weights up their shafts, and she oiled the escapement and she trued the hands, and the clock ran. People set their lives by it. The schoolmaster rang his bell to it, and the trains, when the schedule slipped, which it did, the trains were corrected against it. Della Hartwell's clock kept the official time of Sable Crossing, and Della Hartwell kept the clock, and there was something in that the whole town leaned on without ever thanking her for it. She bought her own house, a narrow stone-and-frame place on the corner of Main and Quill Street, with the shop on the ground floor and her rooms above. She owned it outright. She owned it free of any man, which she'd remind the bank of, gently, every time the bank gentleman, a Mr. Tyndall, came around to suggest that a woman alone might find her affairs simpler in the care of a husband, by which he meant himself, and by which he also, not coincidentally, meant the corner lot, which the bank wanted for reasons of its own. She refused Tyndall the way she did everything, without raising her voice and without leaving any doubt. "I find my affairs are very simple, Mr. Tyndall," she said, where I could hear it, having come up to her shop to have her look at my pocket watch, which she did for me at no charge for years, and I never had the grace to argue. "They're simple because I keep them myself. A husband would only complicate them." "A woman gets lonely, Miss Hartwell," he said, which was the cruelest thing he could have reached for and the dullest. "So does a man," she said. "I notice it hasn't simplified yours." I about swallowed my own teeth. Tyndall left. That was the woman Eli Bracken came back to. Not a girl who'd spent 15 years at a window. A woman who'd built a whole life with her 2 hands and her own name on the deed, who kept the time for a town that took her for granted, and who had decided, somewhere in those years, that she'd rather be the unmarried watchmaker than half of an arrangement. Whether she'd stopped loving him, I couldn't have told you in April. I don't think she could have told you either. There's a kind of love that you put away not because it died, but because keeping it out where you could see it hurt too much to live with, and so you wrap it in cloth and lay it in a drawer with the other things you can't use and can't throw away. She'd done that. We all do that. I had a drawer of my own, as it would turn out, and what was in it was about to come up into the light. They met first by accident, which is the only way 2 proud people that frightened were ever going to manage it. He came into the shop. I had this from her own telling, years on, and from his, and the 2 accounts differ in the small ways that tell you both of them were too rattled to remember it true. He came in to have a watch looked at, an old one, a cheap one, a thing that any tinker could have set right, And that was the tell, because Eli Bracken did not need a reason to walk into a shop and have a thing fixed. He could have bought 10 new watches. He came in because it was her shop and he had built up the nerve, and the watch was a thing to hold in his hands, so his hands wouldn't be empty. She was at the bench with a loop to her eye, and she heard the bell, and she said, "I'll be just a moment," without looking up, the way she said it to everyone. And then she looked up. I wasn't there, but I've stood in that shop 100 times, and I know exactly how the light comes through the front window in the late morning, gold and full of the dust off the street. And I know how quiet it gets in there with all those clocks ticking, a quiet made of 10,000 tiny sounds. And I can see her looking up out of the loop and seeing him, a weathered man in good wool with an old watch in his rough hand. And I can see 15 years go through her like a train through a crossing. She set down the loop. She said his name just the once, Eli. And he said hers, Della. And then, by both their accounts, there was a silence so long and so loud that a clock on the wall, a Vienna regulator she'd brought back from the dead for the Methodist parson, chimed the quarter hour into the middle of it, and they both startled like a gun had gone off, and the spell, whatever it was, broke into something more survivable. "You kept the shop," he said. "I kept the shop," she said. "And the clock, I saw it running from the platform. I thought," he stopped. He didn't tell her what he'd thought. That came later. "Somebody had to wind it," she said. He held out the watch. "It stops," he said. "Runs a day and stops. I've carried it a long way." She took it from him, and she would tell me, much later, that her hands were steady when she took it, which surprised her, and that she was glad of the bench and the work because it gave her somewhere to put her eyes. She opened the back of his cheap old watch and looked into its small workings and saw at once what was wrong with it. A worn pinion, a thing of 15 minutes' work. And she did not say so, because if she said so he'd have no reason to come back. And she discovered in that moment that she wanted him to have a reason to come back, and that wanting frightened her more than anything had in years. "It'll take me a few days," she said, which was a lie, the first one she'd told in that shop in a long while. "Come Thursday." He came Thursday, and the Thursday after. The watch was mended by the first Thursday, and they both knew it and neither said it. And he kept finding small things to bring her. A clock his men had turned up in the Vance house, a barometer with a stuck needle, a music box that had belonged to nobody he'd admit to. And she kept finding them more complicated than they were. And the whole town watched this slow business go on, and made up its mind about it well before either of the two principals had made up theirs. Now I have to tell you about the young ones, Toby Innes and Nan Pryor, because they're not a digression. They're the mirror, and Della and Eli both came to see themselves in it before the spring was out, and it changed what they did. Toby Innes was a hand Eli hired for the Vance section, 18, hot-blooded, hard-working, with nothing to his name but a good seat and a bad temper, and a head full of the same dreams Eli had carried out of Sable Crossing 15 years before. And Nan Pryor was a girl in service at the Tyndall house, sharp and quick, and tired of being told what was good for her. And the two of them had taken to meeting at the end of my platform on Sunday afternoons when the trains didn't run, which is how I came to know about them. Some things don't change. The young will always find the empty end of a platform. Toby got it in his head he'd go to the Dakota goldfields and come back rich enough to marry Nan proper. He told me so, leaning on my cage one slow afternoon, his chin up, certain. "A year," he said, "2 at the most. I'll come back with a stake and her father can't say no." And I felt the years drop away, and I was looking at Eli Bracken at 19, and I felt the cold of what I'd done to him come up through the floor of me, and I said something I had no business saying, being who I was. I said, "Don't." He blinked at me. "Don't what?" "Don't go off and tell her to wait," I said. "Don't measure your worth in a stake and make her measure her years against it. I've seen how that arithmetic comes out." My voice did something I didn't intend. "I've seen it come out wrong, son, and the ones who pay it isn't the ones who go. It's the ones who stay and wait. He didn't understand me. How could he? But Nan Pryor did when he told her, and Nan Pryor was not a girl to wait at a window any more than Della Hartwell had turned out to be. She went to Eli Bracken, walked herself out to the Vance section and asked for the boss and stood in front of him in the yard and said, near as I ever pieced it together, "Mr. Bracken, you're going to talk Toby out of the gold fields, because I won't spend my best years waiting on a boy who thinks he has to be rich to deserve me, and you of all men ought to know why. You of all men ought to know why." She didn't know the whole of it. She just knew the shape of it, the way a whole town half knew the shape of it. But it went into Eli Bracken like a blade, because it named the thing he'd done to his own life. He'd left because he believed a penniless man had no right to ask for Della Hartwell. He'd spent 15 years making himself a man who had the right, and in the spending he'd lost the very thing he was trying to earn. And here was a girl telling him to spare a boy that exact bargain. Eli kept Toby Inns on at top wages and made him a foreman before the year was out. And Toby married Nan Pryor that autumn in the Methodist church with the Vienna regulator ticking on the wall. And they did not wait, and they did not measure, and they were, last I knew, happy in a way that takes the breath out of you when you think how near they came to the other thing. But that's getting ahead, because Eli did all that and was kind to those two children, and still could not say the simple thing to Della that would have ended both their long silences. And the reason he couldn't was the same reason she couldn't. Each of them believed the other had let go. And worse, far worse, each of them had spent 15 years building a story to live inside, and the story had a villain, and the villain was the other one. His story was this: he had written. He had written and written, that first year especially, pouring himself out onto paper with a hand he was ashamed of, telling her about the country and the cattle and the cold and the way he thought of her at the end of every day. And she had never answered. Not once. Not one line in 15 years. He had decided, the way a man decides a thing in order to survive it, that she had read his letters and chosen not to answer, that her father had been right, that a watchmaker's daughter had come to her senses about a drover, that she had married some sensible man and forgotten him. He'd heard, somewhere along the way, garbled through third hands, that Ambrose Hartwell had died, and he'd assumed Della was long married and gone. When he came back and found her unmarried, keeping the shop, he did not read it as hope. He read it as reproach. He thought, she stayed unmarried, and I am the reason, and she will never forgive me for the years I cost her by going. And her story was this: he had left. He had ridden off to make his fortune, and he had not written, not once, not one line in 15 years. She had waited that first summer at the end of the platform until the waiting shamed her, and then she had stopped going, and she had decided, the way a woman decides a thing in order to survive it, that he had gotten out into the wide world and found it full of things better than a small town and a watchmaker's daughter, that he had forgotten her the way young men forget, that the humming in the air between them had been a thing she'd made up because she was 18 and lonely. When he came back with money and bought 4,000 acres, she did not read it as a man coming home to her. She read it as a man coming home to be a big man in the town that had thought he'd amount to nothing. And she would not, she swore to herself, be a stop on his tour of vindication. You see the trap of it. Each was sure the other had stopped writing, and only one man alive knew that one of them had never stopped at all. That man was me, and the letters that proved it were in my drawer. I have to account now for how I came to still have them, because it doesn't make sense otherwise, that a coward should hold onto the very evidence of his cowardice. When Ambrose Hartwell was dying, it was a long dying, a wasting in the chest that took him most of a winter. He sent for me. I went up to the rooms over the shop where Della was nursing him, and she left us alone at his asking, and the old man, who'd been a hard, clean, upright man his whole life, took my hand in his ruined one and said the thing that has kept me up more nights than I can count. "Linus," he said, "I did her a wrong. I thought I was sparing her, and I did her a wrong, and I haven't the strength left to put it right, and I haven't the courage either, which is worse." He could barely get the air for it. Those letters, the boy's letters, I never burned them. I meant to. I couldn't. There. And here he told me where they were, in a tin box at the back of his own shop safe, the one Della used now and didn't know the false bottom of. I couldn't burn them and I couldn't give them to her, and I've carried it like a stone. And now I'm leaving it to you. God help you, because there's nobody else who knows. I said, Ambrose, what do you want me to do? And the dying man looked at me with his clean watchmaker's eyes gone yellow and dim, and he said, I don't know, maybe nothing. Maybe she's better off never knowing she was loved that faithful and lost it to an old man's pride. Or maybe he stopped and gathered himself, and what he said next I've turned over 10,000 times. Maybe someday the boy comes back. They do sometimes. And if he does, Linus, if he does, you'll know what's right. You'll know better than I did. You couldn't do worse. Then he asked me to bring his daughter back in, and I did. And he died 11 days later, and I left those letters where they were, in the false bottom of a safe in a shop owned by a woman who didn't know they existed, ticking their silence out under 10,000 other tickings, and I told myself I was waiting to know what was right. The truth is I was waiting, because doing nothing is the easiest thing a coward ever does, and I was the most practiced coward in the county. But there was a second tin. That's the thing I haven't told you and have to, because Ambrose in his pride had not only had me hold the letters as they came, he'd kept his own. Every letter Eli wrote that I handed him, he'd saved, near 20 of them across 5 years, in a tin of his own that went into that same safe. So there were 2 tins. The boy's letters to Della that she'd never seen, and the proof in the father's own keeping that they'd been intercepted. The whole crime, filed and dated, sitting in the dark at the back of the shop where she worked every day, the way the worst secrets always sit closest to the people they concern. I knew it was there. For 10 years after Ambrose died, I knew it was there, and I let it sit, and I let Della Hartwell go on believing she'd been forgotten, and I told myself I was sparing her, which was the exact lie her father had told himself, passed down to me like a watch that only kept the wrong time. It was the clock that finally undid me. I have to laugh, a little telling it because of all the things. There came a Thursday in May when the town clock stopped. It hadn't stopped in 15 years. Della Hartwell wound it twice a week and it ran, and the town set its hours by it. And then one Thursday it stopped, at 8:20 in the morning, and the whole town noticed at once the way you notice a sound only when it ends. The schoolmaster's bell came at the wrong time. The trains argued with each other. Mr. Tyndall's bank opened, by his own watch, 4 minutes early, and somebody made a joke about it that he didn't care for. Della went up the tower to see to it, and she found that a part had failed, a small steel part, a thing of her father's era that had finally given out, and she did not have another and could not make one and would have to send away for it, which meant the clock would be stopped a week or more, which meant Sable Crossing would go a week or more without its time. And Eli Bracken, who had been finding small broken things to bring her all spring, heard about the clock the way the whole town heard, and he came up to her shop, and he did a thing that was either the bravest or the most foolish of his life, depending on how you count. He said, "Let me help you fix it." Now understand, he knew nothing about clocks. He was a cattleman with rough hands, but he'd watched her with the small machinery all spring, and he'd seen how her face was when she brought a dead thing back to running, and he understood, the way a man finally understands the thing he should have understood at 19, that the clock wasn't a clock. It was the thing she'd kept. It was the years she'd spent keeping the town's time while her own ran out. And he wanted, more than he'd wanted anything since he came back, to be a man who helped her wind it. She looked at him a long moment, and then by her own account she did the thing she'd sworn she wouldn't. She let him. She wrote off for the part, and while they waited the week for it to come, the two of them went up the tower together twice to keep the great weights from running all the way down, and they stood in that cold high room full of the smell of old wood and machine oil with the whole town spread out below them, and they did not even then say the true thing. But they stood close, and he held the crank steady while she set the pawl. and something in both of them that had been wound down for 15 years began, by quarter turns, to come back up. The part came on the eastbound. I signed for it myself. A small steel thing in a paper twist, sent from a foundry back east, and I held it in my swollen hand on my platform, and I thought about all the small steel things that decide the running of a life, and I made up my mind. I had been making up my mind for 10 years and never finishing the job. That day I finished it. I did not give Della the part. I gave it to Eli, who'd come down to the depot for the very reason of meeting that train, having learned it was coming, and I put the little twist of paper in his hand and I said, "Bring it up to her." And then I said, before I could lose my nerve, "And come back here after, son, before you go home. There's a thing in my safe I should have given you 15 years ago." He didn't understand. He looked at the part and at me, and something crossed his weathered face, but he didn't understand, and I didn't explain because I didn't have the words yet for the size of it. I just said, "After. Come back after." He brought the part to Della, and she fitted it, her hands sure and his hands clumsy and useful beside her, and they wound the clock back up, and the great hands moved, and somewhere below them the schoolmaster heard the quarter chime and rang his bell on time for the first time in a week, and the town let out a breath it didn't know it was holding. Della Hartwell stood in the tower with grease on her fingers and Eli Bracken beside her, and the clock running, the clock she'd kept all those years finally being kept by two, and she would tell me later that she nearly said it then. Nearly turned to him and asked the question that had sat in her for 15 years. "Why didn't you write?" She didn't. Pride or fear or the simple terror of an answer she couldn't survive. She didn't ask. But the asking was about to be taken out of both their hands. Eli came back to the depot in the late afternoon, the light going long and gold across the rails, the platform empty, the next train 2 hours off. He came in and stood in front of my cage the way he'd stood in front of it at 19 counting his coins, and he said, "What's this thing you should have given me, Mr. Crow?" And I came out from behind the cage, and I went to my safe, the depot safe where I kept the cash box and the bonded mail and the things a station master keeps, and from the bottom of it I took the tin. Not the boy's letters to Della. Those were in her shop in her father's safe, and I'd have to send her up there myself in the end. The tin in my safe was the other proof. It was every letter Eli Bracken had written that I'd taken off my own counter and never let reach her, the ones I'd held back myself those first months before I started handing them to Ambrose, the few I'd kept, telling myself I'd find a way, and never had. A small tin of a young man's handwriting, postmarked Cheyenne and Ogallala and Miles City, addressed in that cramped, careful hand to Della Hartwell, Sable Crossing, and never opened, because they'd never been delivered. I put the tin on the counter between us. He looked at it. He read the address on the topmost letter, his own address, his own hand, and the name on it, and I watched the blood go out of his face. "These are mine," he said. "I wrote these. This is—" He picked one up. His hands were shaking, a cattleman's steady hands shaking like a boy's. "This is the one I wrote from Cheyenne the first month. I remember I told her about the snow. I told her he couldn't finish. He turned it over. The seal was unbroken. 15 years and the seal was unbroken. 'It's never been opened,' he said. 'Mr. Crow, it's never been opened. Why hasn't it?' And then he understood. I watched it land on him, the whole shape of it, 15 years collapsing into one cold instant on a depot platform. 'She never got them,' he said, quiet, terrible. 'She never got any of them.' 'No,' I said. 'Who?' he said. And then, because he was a smart man and the answer was already in the room, 'You held them.' 'I held the first of them,' I said. 'And then I gave the rest to her father who'd asked me to. He kept them. He kept yours and he kept the ones you wrote after, all of them in a tin in his own safe, which is in her shop now, behind a false bottom she doesn't know is there. She never saw one, Eli, not the first and not the last. She thought you never wrote. She has thought that for 15 years, and you thought she never answered, and neither of you ever stopped." My voice gave out. I had to stop and find it. Neither of you ever stopped. That's the part I have to tell you, son. You both stopped writing because you each thought the other one had quit, but it wasn't either of you. It was an old man's fear and a younger man's cowardice. And I am the younger man, and I have carried this for 15 years, and I have no excuse on God's earth except that I was a coward who let a respected man tell me what was right. And I have wronged you, and I have wronged her, worse than I have ever wronged a living soul. He stood there with his letter in his hand. I thought he might strike me. I'd have let him. I almost wanted him to, the way you want a sentence handed down so you can stop dreading it. He didn't strike me. He sat down. There was a bench along the depot wall, and he sat down on it heavily, like a man whose legs had quit, and he held that unopened letter in both hands, and he looked at it. And after a while he said, in a voice scraped down to nothing, 15 years. Yes, I said. I thought she chose against me. He said it to the floor. Every cold night I had out there, and there were 1,000 of them, I lay in the dark and told myself she'd read what I wrote and chose against me. That she was right to. That a smart girl came to her senses. I built my whole life around her having stopped loving me. And she never, he looked up at me and his eyes were wet, a hard man's eyes, and I'll carry that look to my grave alongside the rest of it. She never even got to choose, he said. We never got to choose, somebody chose for us. Yes, I said, and I let them. He was quiet a long time. The light went redder on the rails. Somewhere up the hill the town clock, her clock, their clock now, chimed the hour. 6 clean strokes across the evening, and we both heard it, and neither of us said anything about it. But I think we both understood that the very sound of the time being kept was her, was the thing she'd done with the years that were stolen from her, was the proof that she'd made a life and not just waited inside the ruin of one. When he spoke again he'd changed. The grief was still in him, but something else had come up under it, hard and clear. Does she know, he said, any of it, about the false bottom, about the letters? No, I said, she doesn't know they exist. Then she has to, he said. She has to know before anything else can happen between us. She has to know she was loved that whole time. She spent 15 years thinking she wasn't worth a letter. I won't have her think it one more day. He stood up. He put the unopened letter inside his coat against his chest. But it can't come from me, he said. If I bring her a tin of letters and tell her I wrote, she's got nothing but my word and a stranger's pity. She has to find them in her own father's hand, in her own shop. She has to see it's true with her own eyes. He looked at me, and there was no forgiveness in his face yet, but there was no cruelty either, just a terrible clarity. And you have to be the one to send her to them, Mr. Crow. You owe her that. You owe her the truth from the man who kept it. So that's how it came to be that I, Linus Crow, the most practiced coward in the county, climbed the hill to Della Hartwell's shop on a red May evening with my hat in my swollen hands, to tell a woman a thing 15 years too late. She was at her bench. The shop was full of the ticking, all those clocks she'd brought back from the dead, and the gold light was going out of the front window, and she looked up out of her loop the way she did, ready to say, I'll be just a moment. And then she saw my face, and she set the loop down slowly, because a woman who'd waited at the end of a platform knows the look of a man come to deliver something heavy. Linus, she said, what is it? And I will not pretend I said it well. I said it badly in pieces, doubling back, my voice failing and starting. I told her about her father. I told her what he'd asked of me and what I'd done. I told her there was a tin in the back of her own safe, behind a false bottom her father had built, and that there was a second tin in mine, and that what was in both of them was 15 years of letters from Eli Bracken that she had never seen, because her father had feared for her and I had been a coward, and that the boy she'd thought forgot her had written and written and written, and that the silence she'd lived inside her whole young womanhood was a thing that had been done to her, and not chosen by anyone who loved her. I watched it go through her the way I'd watched it go through him, but she didn't sit down. She'd had more practice standing up under heavy things, I expect. She stood very straight at her bench with the ticking all around her, and her face went white and then very still, and she said, "Show me." I showed her. She went to her father's safe, the one she'd used every working day for 10 years, and I showed her where the false bottom was. The seam her father's hands had made so clean that even a watchmaker's daughter had never found it. And she pressed it the way I showed her and it lifted, and there was the tin. She opened it at her bench in the last of the light, and she lit the lamp because the light was going, and she took out the letters one by one. Her father's filing was meticulous. The way the whole crime was meticulous, dated and ordered, the boy's cramped hand on every envelope. She did not open them in a rush. She opened them in order, the way you'd open the years, and she read the first one, the Cheyenne one, the one about the snow, the one Eli had said he remembered. And I watched a woman who had built a whole life on the belief that she had not been worth a single line discover that she had been worth 100. She read for a long time. I should have left her to it, and I didn't, because she didn't tell me to go, and I didn't trust myself to leave her alone with it. So I stood by the door and I watched her read 15 years of a man's faithfulness by lamplight, and I watched her not cry, which was worse than crying. And at some point the town clock chimed the half hour, her clock, and she stopped reading and listened to it the way you'd listen to your own heart, and then she went back to the letters. When she'd read enough, not all, you couldn't read all in a night, but enough, she set the last one down and she put her 2 hands flat on the bench and she looked at them, her watchmaker's hands, and she said, not to me exactly. He told me about the snow and the cattle, and he said, her voice did a thing. He said in this one that he thought of me at the end of every day, and I spent every day of those years thinking he'd forgotten my face. Della, I said. You held them, she said. She wasn't asking. My father had you hold them and you held them. Yes. And then he held them, and then he died and left them to you, and you held them 10 years more. Yes. She looked at me then, full on, and there was a grief in her face so large I had to make myself stand in it and not look away, because looking away was the thing I'd done my whole life, and I'd decided on the platform that I was done. Do you know what you took? She said, quiet. Not the letters. The letters are paper, I can read them now. Do you know what you took? You took the knowing. All those years I could have been a woman who was loved and waited from strength. Instead I was a woman who was forgotten and made the best of it from shame. Same life, Linus. The exact same shop and the exact same clock and the exact same house, but lived inside a lie instead of a truth. You took the truth I was living in. You and my father. You decided I was better off small. I have been called a great many things in a long life, and I have deserved most of them, but nothing anyone ever said to me cut to the floor of me like that. You decided I was better off small. That was the whole of it. That was what we'd done, her father and I, in the name of sparing her. We'd decided a great love was too much for her to carry, and we'd taken it off her, and we'd handed her a smaller life and told ourselves it was kindness. I have no defense, I said. I won't insult you with one. I was a coward and I let a frightened old man tell me it was right, and I have known for 15 years it was wrong, and I held them anyway, because doing nothing was the easiest thing, and I am, at the bottom of me, an easy man. Your father at least died ashamed. I just got old. I have come up here tonight because Eli Bracken stood in front of my cage with one of those letters in his shaking hand, and told me you had to know you were loved that whole time, and that you had to find it in your own father's hand, and that I had to be the one to send you to it. He's right. He was always a better man than the town gave him credit for, and a better man than I'll ever be, and the proof of it is that he wanted me to bring you the truth, even though the truth makes him a man you might not want anymore. So there it is. I've brought it. Do with me what you want. There's nothing you could lay on me I haven't already laid on myself, and worse. She was quiet, the clocks ticked. The lamp threw her shadow up the wall, long and steady. Where is he? She said. At the depot, I said. He wouldn't come up. He said you had to find it true first with your own eyes before he'd let himself stand in front of you again. He said you'd had enough men decide things for you, and he wouldn't be another. Something moved in her face when I said that, because that was the thing, you see. That was the proof that this man, whatever the years had made him, had finally learned the one lesson that her father and I never had. He would not decide for her. He'd bring her the truth and then he'd stand back and let her choose freely, knowing everything, the way she should have been let to choose at 18. She put the letters back in the tin. She did it carefully in order, the way she did everything, and she closed the lid. And then she said a thing I didn't expect, because I'd braced for grief and I'd braced for fury, and I had not braced for the plain hard practicality of a woman who'd run her own life for 15 years. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," she said. "It isn't. It won't be, maybe not ever, and I'd be a liar to spare you, and I'm done sparing people things, since that's the disease that started all of this." She stood up from the bench. "But I'm not going to spend whatever years I've got left the way I spent the last ones, living inside the wrong story because the people around me were too frightened to give me the right one. I've got the right one now. It cost me 15 years and it cost me you as a friend because I don't know how I look at you across a counter after this, but I've got it. And I'm going to go down to that depot and I'm going to read that man the rest of those letters out loud if I have to until he understands that I never stopped either. And then I'm going to decide myself, with all of it in front of me, what I want the rest of my time to look like. Mine to decide. Not yours, not my father's, not the town's. Mine." And she took the tin under her arm, and she put on her coat, and she walked out of her own shop into the dark, down the hill toward the depot, toward the man she'd thought had forgotten her for 15 years, with the proof that he never had under her arm. To settle the thing herself, the way she'd settled everything else. I did not follow her. Some scenes a man has no right to. But I had the rest from both of them over the years, in the pieces people give you when they've decided to forgive you enough to talk to you again, which she did, eventually, more than I deserved. She found him on the platform. He'd waited there in the cold the whole time, hours, not knowing if she'd come down to him or send word to never show his face again. And he stood up when he saw her come out of the dark with the tin under her arm, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. The two of them on the empty platform at the end of which they'd stood as children pretending to watch the rails. Then she set the tin on the bench and she opened it and she took out a letter and she said, "Read me this one. I want to hear it in your voice. I've read it in your hand and I want it in your voice, because I should have had it in your voice 15 years ago, and I'm too old now to pretend I don't want what I want." And Eli Bracken, cattleman, hard man, took the letter he'd written at 19 from a bunkhouse in Cheyenne, the one about the snow and the cattle and thinking of her at the end of every day, and he read it out loud to her on the platform in the cold, his voice breaking on it, 15 years late, and she stood and listened to every word, and when he finished she didn't say anything wise or large. She just said, "There was so much snow that winter here too. I used to wonder if it was the same snow." "It was the same snow," he said. "It was all the same snow, Della. It was always the same sky over both of us. I just couldn't reach across it." "Somebody held your arm down," she said. "Somebody held my arm down," he agreed. "Well," she said, "it's free now." And that was the whole of the reunion, near as I ever got it. No grand speeches. Two people who'd been robbed of a thing standing in the cold getting it back a piece at a time, by reading old letters aloud, until the cold drove them inside and the years drove them together. They didn't marry in a rush, which I think tells you everything about who they'd both become. They were not a girl and a boy anymore who'd grab a thing for fear of losing it. They were two people who'd lost it once and meant to do it right. She kept her shop. She kept her name on the deed of the corner house. She told him, plain, that she'd built that life with her own hands and she'd not sign it away to be made a wife of. And he, having learned, said he'd want her to keep it, that he'd want the watchmaker who kept the town's time to go on keeping it, and that he had 4,000 acres, but he'd as soon she had her own ground under her too. So they kept two homes for a while, the ranch and the shop, and she'd ride out to the Vance section weekends, and he'd come into town midweek. And the whole arrangement scandalized exactly the people whose opinions neither of them had ever once cared about. She kept winding the clock. That was a thing she would not give up, and he never asked her to. Twice a week she climbed the tower, and after a while he climbed it with her, and the two of them wound the great weights up together, and the town went on setting its hours by a clock kept by a married woman who'd never stopped being her own. They married in the autumn in the Methodist church, with the Vienna regulator ticking on the wall, the same autumn Toby Innes married Nan Pryor, a double wedding that the town talked about for years, the young couple who didn't wait and the old couple who'd waited 15 years for nothing and refused to wait a day more. Della Hartwell wore gray, not white, and didn't apologize for it, and Eli Bracken stood up beside her steady as a fence post set deep. And when the parson asked if anyone knew a reason they should not be joined, the whole church was quiet, because the only man who'd ever stood between them was sitting in the back pew with his hat in his swollen hands, and he kept his peace, having finally, 15 years too late, learned to let two people decide their own lives. That was me. I was in the back pew. She let me come. I counted among the great mercies of my life that Della Hartwell, after what I'd cost her, let me sit in the back of that church and watch her marry the man I'd helped keep her from. She never fully forgave me, and she was right not to, and she never pretended to, and I respected her for that more than I'd have respected an easy forgiveness. But she let me come. And after, on the church porch, with the autumn light coming down, she stopped in front of me and she said, "You could have told him at the depot the morning he came back. You could have ended it that day. Why'd you wait the whole spring?" And I told her the truth because I'd sworn off the other thing. Because I was a coward to the last, I said. I waited until the clock stopped. I needed a thing to make me brave, and a man like me, the bravest thing I can find is a small steel part on a train. I'm sorry, Della, for all of it, for the 15 years and the spring on top of them. She looked at me a long moment, and then she said the thing I've held on to, the thing that's let me tell this story at all without it crushing me flat. She said, "The 15 years are mine to grieve, and I'll grieve them my whole life. But I got the truth in the end, and I got him in the end, and I got him knowing he never quit, which is worth more than the easy version where he simply came home, and I never knew what we'd been robbed of. You stole my years, Linus. But you brought me the truth before I died not knowing it. That doesn't square the account. Nothing squares it, but it's not nothing." She put her hand on my arm just once. "Don't carry it to where it kills you," she said. "I've had enough of my time taken by men deciding things. Don't take any more of yours." Then she went down the porch steps to her husband, who was holding the buggy, and she took his hand, and the two of them drove out of town toward the Vance section in the autumn light, an old married couple of 1 hour standing. And I stood on the church porch and listened to the town clock chime the hour over my head. Her clock, 6 clean strokes into the gold afternoon, the official time of Sable Crossing, kept all those years by a woman who waited and didn't wait, who was robbed and rebuilt, who got her truth back too late to undo the loss, and right on time to spend what was left of her life inside it instead of the lie. They had 14 years together. I'll tell you that because it matters, and because it's the arithmetic that keeps me up still. 14 years against the 15 we stole. She outlived him by a little, and she kept winding the clock right up until the winter before she went, an old woman climbing a tower with a crank because she would not ask the council for a man to do it. And when she died, they had to find somebody to wind the clock, and it took 3 men to do the job she'd done alone for 30 years all told. And not one of them did it as true, and the town's time has run a little wrong ever since, a minute here, 2 there, the way it does when the one who kept it right is gone. I am very old now, older than a coward has any right to get. I have outlived nearly everyone in this story, which is its own kind of sentence. And when the eastbound comes through and shudders to a stop at my old platform, they let me sit out there still, on fine days, an old man on a bench by the rails. I think about the boy who counted his coins twice and the man who came back braced against a wind, and I think about a tin of letters in a false-bottomed safe, and I think about all the small steel parts that decide the running of a life, and I think about the thing she said to me on the church porch. "Don't take any more of yours." I've tried not to. It's the only penance left to a man too old to make any other kind. So when I see two young ones at the end of my platform on a Sunday when the trains don't run, a boy with his chin up and a girl who's done being told what's good for her, I get up off my bench, and my hip howls, and I go over, and I tell them the only thing 15 years and a tin of letters ever taught me worth passing on. Don't go off and tell her to wait. Don't measure your worth in a stake and make her measure her years against it. And whatever you do, whatever frightened, respectable voice tells you it's for the best, don't ever, ever let anybody decide for the two of you. That's yours. The deciding is the only thing that's truly yours. Keep it. And then I go back to my bench, and I wait for the next train, the way I've waited for every train for 60 years. And up the hill the clock keeps the wrong time now. A little the way it has since she left us. The hours of all those minutes running on without the one woman who knew how to keep them true.